All right, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel, and thanks for tuning in today. This is an educational channel. We try to let you know about things that are important in your own life for your spiritual, mental, and physical health, but you probably don't know about them because they have been suppressed. Things that the powers that be don't want you to know about. And in particular, this is our 339th Bible Decode. We're going to be telling you about some things that your pastor, your priest, your rabbi doesn't want you to know about. Because that would make it very difficult for them to keep their grift up. And so we've been looking a little bit at the deist part of the equation. As you may know, many of the founders of this great republic were deists, including arguably the first 5 presidents, and also Benjamin Franklin and Ethan Allen, Thomas Young, and in this case we're looking at the work of Thomas Paine, who you may know from the pamphlet Common Sense that he wrote right around this time, 250 years ago in 1776, as a precursor toward the Declaration of Independence. But this is a later work of his that came out almost 20 years later, called The Age of Reason, where he gets into his exposition of deism. And you may know deism is the belief in one God, but this is a God that doesn't write books, but instead leaves its message in the creation itself and endows us with faculties including our God-fearing reason, where we can penetrate the mind of God, so to speak, through beholding the creation. Whether you're talking about reverence, meditation, or stargazing, sun gazing, gazing through a microscope, or just gazing at nature. These are all ways that you can understand the creation, and they are all uncontaminated by books and language that is naturally human and not divine. Now we are in part 2 of this book, which is about the Old Testament, and we're in the middle of a very long chapter. So he had just gotten done talking about how the book of Judges and the book of Joshua were not written by Joshua, and that the Pentateuch, the first five books of the Old Testament, were not written by Moses. And so if you want to have a discussion of that, you can go to the earlier videos. Now we're, I guess, moving on to the book of Ruth. Having now shown that every book in the Bible from Genesis to Judges is without authenticity, I come to the book of Ruth, an idle, bungling story foolishly told, nobody knows by whom, about a strolling country girl creeping slyly to bed to her cousin Boaz. Pretty stuff indeed to be called the Word of God. It is, however, one of the best books in the Bible, for it is free from murder and rape. I come next to the 2 books of Samuel, and to show that those books were not written by Samuel, nor till a great length of time after the death of Samuel, and that they are, like all the former books, anonymous and without authority. To be convinced that these books have been written much later than the time of Samuel, and consequently not by him, it is only necessary to read the account which the writer gives of Saul going to seek his father's asses, and of his interview with Samuel, of whom Saul went to inquire about those lost asses. As foolish people nowadays go to a conjurer to inquire after lost things. The writer, in relating this story of Saul, Samuel, and the asses, does not tell it as a thing that had just happened, but as an ancient story in the time this writer lived, for he tells it in the language or terms used at the time Samuel lived, which obliges the writer to explain the story in terms of language used in the time the writer lived. Samuel, in the account given of him in the first of those books, chapter 9, verse 13, called the seer, and it is by this term that Saul inquires after him. In verse 11, quote, and as they, meaning Saul and his servant, as they went up the hill to the city, they found young maidens going out to draw water, and they said unto them, is the seer here? Saul then went according to the direction of these maidens, and met Samuel without knowing him, and said unto him in verse 18, tell me, I pray thee, where the seer's house is. And Samuel answered Saul and said, I am the seer. As the writer of the book of Samuel relates these questions and answers, in the language or manner of speaking used in the time they are said to have been spoken, and as that manner of speaking was out of use when this author wrote, he found it necessary, in order to make the story understood, to explain the terms in which these questions and answers are spoken. And before he does this, in the 9th verse, where he says, before time in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, thus he spake, come, let us go to the seer, for he that is now called a prophet was before time called a seer. This proves, as I have said, that this story of Saul, Samuel, and the asses was an ancient story at the time the book of Samuel was written, and consequently that Samuel did not write it, and that the book is without authenticity. But if we go further into those books, the evidence is still more positive that Samuel is not the writer of them, for they relate things that did not happen until several years after the death of Samuel. Samuel died before Saul. For 1 Samuel 28 tells that Saul and the witch of Endor conjured Samuel up after he was dead, and yet the history of matters contained in those books extended through the remaining part of Saul's life and to the latter end of the life of David, who succeeded Saul. The account of the death and burial is something that Samuel could not write himself, is related in 1 Samuel 25. And the chronology affixed to this chapter makes this to be BC 1060, yet the history of the first book is brought down to BC 1056, that is, to the death of Saul, which was not till 4 years after the death of Samuel. The second book of Samuel begins with an account of things that did not happen till 4 years after Samuel was dead. For it begins with the reign of David, who succeeded Saul, and it goes on to the end of David's reign, which was 43 years after the death of Samuel. And therefore, the books are in themselves positive evidence that they were not written by Samuel. I have now gone through all the books in the first part of the Bible to which the names of persons are affixed as being the authors of those books, and which the church, styling itself the Christian church, have imposed upon the world as the writings of Moses, Joshua, and Samuel. And I have detected and proved the falsehood of this imposition. And now, ye priests of every description, who have preached and written against the former part of the age of reason, meaning part A of this book, which was written a few years before the second part. The first part he had to kind of rush out because he was living in Paris at the time in the early 1790s, and he knew he was about to be arrested, and he thought that they might chop his head off. And so he literally finished the first part of the book just hours before he was arrested. They spared his head, and he got out of prison before too long, and ended up getting back to the United States eventually and dying, I believe, in New York in about 1809. So that's what he means when he says the former part of the Age of Reason. So he's gotten some criticism of that first part, which I've gone over in the videos maybe 1 through A through J or so. What have ye to say? Will ye, with all this mass of evidence against you, and staring you in the face, still have the assurance to march into your pulpits and continue to impose these books on your congregations as the works of inspired penmen and the works of God? When it is as evident as demonstration can make truth appear, that the persons who ye say ye are, the persons who ye say are the authors are not the authors, and that ye know not who the authors are. What shadow of pretense have ye now to produce for continuing the blasphemous fraud? What have ye still to offer against the pure and moral religion of deism, in support of your system of falsehood, idolatry, and pretended revelation? Had the cruel and murdering orders with which the Bible is filled, and the numberless torturing executions of men, women, and children in consequence of those orders been ascribed to some friend whose memory you revered, you would have glowed with satisfaction at detecting the falsehood of the charge, and gloried in defending his injured fame. It is because ye are sunk in the cruelty of superstition, and feel no interest in the honor of your Creator, that ye listen to the horrid tales of the Bible, or hear them with callous indifference. The evidence I have produced, and shall still produce in the course of this work, is to prove that the Bible is without authority, will, whilst it wounds the stubbornness of a priest, relieve and tranquilize the minds of millions. It will free them from all those hard thoughts of the Almighty which priestcraft and the Bible had infused into their minds, and which stood in everlasting opposition to all their ideas of his moral justice and benevolence. I come now to the 2 books of Kings and the 2 books of Chronicles. Those books are altogether historical and are chiefly confined to the lives and actions of the Jewish kings, who in general were a parcel of rascals. But these are matters with which we have no more concern than we have with the Roman emperors or Homer's account of the Trojan War, besides which as those books are anonymous, and as we know nothing of the writer or of his character, it is impossible for us to know what degree of credit to give to the matters related therein. Like all other ancient histories, they appear to be a jumble of fable and of fact, and of probable and of improbable things, but which distance of time and place and change of circumstances in the world have rendered obsolete and uninteresting. The chief use I shall make of those books will be that of comparing them with each other and with other parts of the Bible to show the confusion, contradiction, and cruelty in this pretended Word of God. The first book of Kings begins with the reign of Solomon, which according to the Bible chronology was BC 1015, and the second book ends in BC 588, being a little after the reign of Zedekiah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, after taking Jerusalem and conquering the Jews, carried captive to Babylon. The two books include a space of 427 years. The two books of Chronicles are a history of the same times and in general of the same persons by another author, for it would be absurd to suppose that that same author who wrote the history twice over. The first book of Chronicles, after giving the genealogy from Adam to Saul, which takes up the first 9 chapters, begins with the reign of David, and the last book ends, as in the last book of Kings, soon after the reign of Zedekiah, about 588 BC. The last 2 verses of the last chapter bring the history 52 years more forward, that is to 536. But these verses do not belong to the book, as I shall show when I come to speak of the book of Ezra. 2 books of Kings, besides the history of Saul, David, and Solomon, who reigned over all Israel, contain an abstract of the lives of 17 kings and 1 queen, who are styled kings of Judah, and of 19 who are styled kings of Israel. For the Jewish nation, immediately on the death of Solomon, split into 2 parties, who chose separate kings and who carried on most rancorous wars against each other. These 2 books are little more than a history of assassinations, treachery, and wars. The cruelties that the Jews had accustomed themselves to practice on the Canaanites, whose country they had savagely invaded under a pretended gift from God, they afterwards practiced as furiously on each other. Scarcely half of their kings died a natural death, and in some instances whole families were destroyed to secure possession of the succession, who after a few years, and sometimes only a few months or less, shared the same fate. In 2 Kings 10, an account is given of 2 baskets full of children's heads, 70 in number, being exposed at the entrance of the city. They were the children of Ahab and were murdered by the order of Jehu, whom Elisha, the pretended man of God, had anointed to be king over Israel, on purpose to commit this bloody deed and assassinate his predecessor. And in the account of the reign of Menahem, one of the kings of Israel who had murdered Shalom, who had reigned but 1 month, it is said in 2 Kings 15:16 that Menahem smote the city of Tiphsah, because they opened not the city to him, and all the women therein that were with child he ripped up. Could we permit ourselves to suppose that the Almighty would distinguish any nation of people by the name of his chosen people? We must suppose that people to have been an example to all the rest of the world of the purest piety and humanity, and not such a nation of ruffians and cutthroats as the ancient Jews were. A people who, corrupted by and copying after such monsters and impostors as Moses and Aaron, Joshua, Samuel, and David, had distinguished themselves above all others on the face of the known earth for barbarity and wickedness. If we will not stubbornly shut our eyes and steel our hearts, it is impossible not to see, in spite of all that long-established superstition imposes upon the mind, that the flattering appellation of his chosen people is no other than a lie, which the priests and leaders of the Jews had invented to cover the baseness of their own characters, and which Christian priests, sometimes as corrupt and often as cruel, have professed to believe. The two books of Chronicles are a repetition of the same crimes, but the history is broken in several places by the author leaving out the reign of some of their kings, and in this as well as in that of kings, there is such a frequent transition from kings of Judah to kings of Israel, and from kings of Israel to kings of Judah, that the narrative is obscure in the reading. In the same book, the history sometimes contradicts itself. For example, in 2 Kings 1:17, we are told, but in rather ambiguous terms, that after the death of Ahaziah, king of Israel, Jehoram, or Joram, who was of the house of Ahab, reigned in his stead in the second year of Jehoram, or Joram, son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. And in chapter 8, verse 16 of the same book, it is said, quote, "And in the 5th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, Jehoshaphat being then king of Judah, Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, began to reign." That is, one chapter says Joram of Judah began to reign in the 2nd year of Joram of Israel, and the other chapter says that Joram of Israel began to reign in the 5th year of Joram of Judah. Several of the most extraordinary matters related in one history as having happened during the reign of such of their kings are not to be found in the other, in relating the reign of the same king. For example, the two first rival kings after the death of Solomon were Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And in 1 Kings 12 and 13, an account is given of Jeroboam making an offering of burnt incense, and that a man who is there called a man of God cried out against the altar. In chapter 8, verse 2, "O altar, altar, thus saith the Lord, behold, a child shall be born unto the house of David, Josiah by name. And upon thee shall he offer the priests of the high places that burn incense upon thee, and men's bones shall be burned upon thee." In verse 4 it says, "And it came to pass, when King Jeroboam heard the saying of the man of God, which had cried against the altar in Bethel, that he put forth his hand from the altar, saying, Lay hold on him. And his hand, which he put out against him, dried up, so that he could not pull it again to him." One would think that such an extraordinary case as this, which is spoken of as a judgment happening to the chief of one of the parties, and that at the first moment of the separation of the Israelites into two nations would, if it had been true, have been recorded in both histories. But though men in later times have believed all that the prophets have said unto them, it does appear that those prophets or historians disbelieved each other. They knew each other too well. Okay, now I think he's going to go into talk about Elijah here, and I think this might be a good place to stop it off, because yeah, I think this goes on for a little while. Yeah, well, Thomas Paine is doing a fair amount of nitpicking here, and reading into the text, minor errors and such like, which I think is important. But to me, more important is just the simple idea that these books are not the Word of God, and anybody who is a truther, anybody who believes in the truth, has to acknowledge that. That goes against the Word of God, that goes against all evidence, all common sense, and all of history, to think that some humans are inspired to write the Word of God, or that God wrote these things himself in one language or another, Hebrew in this case. It just doesn't stand up to the scrutiny that truthers would apply to any other document. These days, all of the conspiracy theorists out there, I'm one of them, and people who are not taking documents at face value, but looking into, figuring out what they really are about by looking at the sources and the methods and the agendas that are actually behind the various texts. This does not deserve a free pass. The New Testament and the Old Testament does not deserve a free pass from you, and just to call it the Word of God and move on and assume that everything that's written therein is the truth. That just is not what a truther would do. A truther would subjugate the document to scrutiny, meaning not just read it, but figure out who wrote it, where did it come from, when was it written, why was it written, in what language was it written, and in what language was it not written. And once those things happen, and especially when you apply common sense to both the Old and the New Testament, they do not stand up to scrutiny. Now, in some cases, you may need a little bit of help decoding the New Testament. You have to start with the work of Josephus, the historian, Jewish Roman historian Josephus, who I don't even believe was a real person, but his 7-volume work, Jewish War, gives you the code that you need to understand the New Testament, because it's clear that whoever Josephus was, he was also the author of the Gospels. And the hidden parallels between the two are overwhelming. In particular, the fact that the war described as the war between the Jews and the Romans, and the two Roman generals in the in the war are Vespasian and his son Titus, who eventually become the new Roman emperors. And if you look at Titus's military campaign in Judea, it is a replica of the ministry of Jesus. They both go to the same locations in the same order and encounter the same circumstances at each location. Jesus encounters the events in symbolic manner. Titus encounters the events in literal manner. And the events are exactly 40 years apart. So they are embedding a code there. And then when you take all of the parallels between the two, especially in the book of Luke, there are 250 parallels just in the book of Luke, 10 per chapter. And when you graph them on a chart, they graph out 5 near perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman Caesars. In other words, the Roman Caesars literally signed their names, or at least their initials, to the book of Luke. And this is all covered by both Joseph Atwill's Caesar's Messiah and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, and also Michael Menescott's book called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. Now, when you get to the Old Testament, you have to recognize that God, the God with capital G, is phased out in Genesis 1, first chapter, and is replaced by God with a small g, by several gods called Elohims, and they're not gods. They are just beings that are more powerful or technologically advanced than we are. They all have various